Whose voices do we listen to and how do we respond? We'll come back to that question later. I've had the opportunity as a pastor over the past dozen years to work with quite a few congregations that are in transition or in some state of distress, and sometimes I will ask them to share the story of their congregation. And often, when I ask that question, it goes something like this. Well, the congregation started in 19-whatever, when the mission developer, Pastor what's-his-name, showed up. He was there for 6 years. And then the next pastor was fantastic. And when she was here, the choir doubled in size, and we built onto the building, and everything was going great. And then the next guy came, and he was only here for a short time, and we're still not sure why he left. But then the next one came, and things went downhill for a while. But then the next one came, and then it got better again. And it goes something like that. Now, what I asked them to share with me was the story of the congregation, and instead what I got was the story of who was the pastor, with some major events kind of attached to the time when those people were the pastor. What gets left out are all of those other stories of what happened in those years that really shaped the life of who that congregation is. Now, this never surprises me because this is also how, if you ask for a corporate history of a corporation, right? They'll say, well, our founder started the business, and under those years it thrived, and then Junior took over and wasn't as sharp as Dad, right? And then it went downhill. This is also how we tell the history of cities and states and nations, right? It's often through the big events and the people that shape those events. Many times those are men, and because those were the people with power, we get the story through their eyes, right? Not necessarily the little stories that are happening in people's lives all the way along. Now, I would love to tell you that the Bible is different and that it always is giving us a different story, but you can read through Scripture and find a very similar pattern. There are 6 books, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which basically tell you the story of kings. And they look just like any other history we might read, right? This person was the king for 35 years. These 2 big things happened. Then he died. His son took over. He only lasted a little while because he did evil in the sight of the Lord. And then the next one took over, and we get that same kind of history. Today, we hear a story from the book of Acts. Now, I'm going to back up from chapter 9 to chapter 4, and I'm just going to read you the headings of some of the stories. Peter and John before the council. The believers pray for boldness. The apostles heal many. The apostles are persecuted. 7 chose to serve. These were men chose to serve widows. The arrest of Stephen. Stephen's speech to the council. The stoning of Stephen. Saul persecutes the church. Philip preaches in Samaria. Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. The conversion of Saul. Saul preaches in Damascus. Saul escapes from the Jews. Saul in Jerusalem. The healing of Aeneas. Now, Peter is the one that healed Aeneas, and that's the story that happens right before ours. Now, in today's story, Tabitha, who has a name, also called Dorcas, is raised from the dead. That seems like a big deal. What do you suppose the heading in this Bible of that story is? Peter raises her from the dead would be pretty good. Nope. Peter in Lydda and Joppa. It just tells us where he is, even though it's a story that has a woman raised from the dead and other women in the story. The headline is, and Peter went some places, right? So as you read through the book of Acts, it very much seems like the big story is what these apostles, these men were out doing in the church. But what I love about the Bible is that, and maybe this is true in our history as well, those other voices, the quiet voices of the women in these stories, refuse to be silenced. They demand to be heard. And so when you read this story at the one level, it seems like the basic problem is that someone has died, and the solution is that Peter, like Jesus has done in the past, can raise her from the dead. That seems to be the thing, right? She died. Peter raised her from the dead. Let's go along with Peter to the next place he goes, which is to visit Cornelius, the centurion, and baptize his whole household. But there's a whole lot more going on in this story that really does demand to be heard. And to understand it, we have to back up to chapter 6, where there were 7 appointed to care for the widows. In biblical times, widows couldn't care for themselves, right? When their husband died, they didn't have a way of taking care of themselves. They lived often in poverty, and they were some of the most vulnerable people in the community, which is why the prophets are always saying, make sure you care for the widows and the orphans. Well, the church understood that, and so the church was feeding widows. However, in the early church, they were trying to figure out how the Hebrew people that were Jesus's, right, kin, how they would relate to the Gentile Greek people who were starting to follow Jesus. And so they had debates. Do all of those Greek people have to not eat the things we don't eat? Do they have to get circumcised? And amidst all those debates, these widows are being fed, except they were neglecting the Greek widows, right? So they couldn't figure out, like they understood they had to feed the widows, but they maybe thought, well, we just have to feed our widows, maybe not those other widows. So that's helpful to understand that when we come to this story, where Peter seems to be the main character, we get introduced to Tabitha. Tabitha is her name amongst the Hebrew community, but then they also tell us that Dorcas was what her name was in Greek. Now, if you pay attention to the story, first she's introduced as Tabitha. When Peter shows up and brings her back to life, he calls her Tabitha. But when the widows talk about her, what do they call her? Dorcas, which suggests to me that these may have been some of those very Greek widows that were being neglected. Now, in chapter 6, 7 men got appointed to care for them. They don't make an appearance in this story, but she does. And as Peter shows up and gathers around the bed with them, we're told that they wept, and then they began to share their stories. What it tells us is that they showed Peter textiles, pieces of clothing that she had made while she was with them. I think what actually happened was Peter showed up, and one of them said, when my husband died, she showed up, and she made me this when I didn't have anything else. And that was what gave me the hope to keep going. And the next one maybe said, my husband died a long time ago, but Dorcas is the one who made me this. And this is just what I needed in that moment to have a little bit of hope that new life was possible. Tabitha, I think, is actually the only woman in the New Testament given the actual label of disciple, right? And so what we hear in this story is that the problem isn't that she died, and that was the main problem, because she's going to die again. The problem was that there were widows who were not cared for. And the church knew enough to try to feed those people. She, as a disciple of Jesus, showed up and did that work so that when she dies, her ministry now goes with her, unless it gets picked up by someone else. In this case, Peter shows up as the church, brings her back to life so that that can continue. And you would hope that the next time she died, that there were more people there as the church to pick up that work so that those widows can continue to be cared for. But the big story would seem to be that she died, Peter brought back to life. But I think the real story is that there were widows who went uncared for. She showed up and was the church and cared for them. When she died and couldn't do that anymore, the church showed up to continue to make sure that that care and compassion happened. Now, it's not hard to connect that story to our present day, especially in a week like this one where a Supreme Court document was leaked that is all of the news, and there are plenty of big names in the headlines arguing out what we're going to think about all these things. And I wonder, what are the stories that aren't getting heard or told of women in need of care and compassion because no one else is paying attention to them? And we don't actually have to leave the bounds of this congregation to hear those stories. We don't always hear those stories because they need safe space to be told. Women are often doubted or shamed for sharing their stories. There are whole kinds of reasons that they don't get told. But we do have, I already know this, right, within the bounds of our congregation, women who have been assaulted, women who have lived through spousal abuse, women who have lived in poverty as widows, women who have struggled through all kinds of other things, whose stories don't necessarily get heard, and yet we hear a Bible story today that demands that they be told and puts the question before us, how are we going to respond? In the biblical story, Tabitha, Dorcas, showed up. And when she couldn't show up, the church continued to show up. And the reality is, because we don't always tell our stories well, this stuff is happening around us all the time. We once had a woman who I would say was emotionally abused by her boss. She was fired, not because of her incompetence, but his. She came to this place because she knew about us and knew that she could come be herself on a Sunday and hear about God's love. And she sat in a pew and cried all the way through worship. Now, there's two wrong ways for a congregation to respond to that. One of them is to just ignore it. The other one is for everyone to go gather around and go, "Are you okay?" Right? That's overwhelming. What actually happened was one person went up to her and said, "You look like you could use a hug." She told me later, "I'm not a hugger, but I did need a hug." And that person gave me hope that my next steps were going to be okay and that something new was going to happen. No one knew that happened here that day, right? It was a quiet interaction between two women, one who was suffering and one who showed up and was the church. I once had a young woman come visit me in my office. Her husband just up and left. And she was in tears, trying to imagine, how is this going to unfold? What's going to be the next steps? The previous summer, the congregation had what we call dinner groups, where 4 or 5 families would get together and they would have dinner, month to month in each person's house, or maybe they would go out to eat, however they did it, to just build relationships and get to know each other. And it turned out that she had been in one of those dinner groups with 3 or 4 other couples, all of whom were twice their age, right, old enough to be their parents or grandparents. That next Sunday, she walked up towards the front doors of the church. I'm the only one that knows what's going on, right? And one of those women looked at her and said, "Where's your husband this week?" At which point, she quietly got to hear the story. At which point, those other several women, all of whom had walked with people through divorce and death and infidelity and struggles with children and every other struggle you can imagine, quietly gathered round her. They carried her through that morning in church and well on into the next steps that she had. She never came to talk to me again because she didn't need a pastor. She needed the church, and those women of the church showed up for her. The other thing about these stories is I think many of them don't actually happen in the church. We visited my grandma when I was in seminary. She herself was a widow in her late 70s. And while we were there, she had almost lost the use of her hand, her good hand. And so she had all these gadgets to open things. I said, "Grandma, let me do some stuff." She's like, "No, I'm fine." But then she had to go run some errands. And I'm curious, so I asked lots of questions. And it turned out that she had found these 2 women that were both 100 who couldn't get out of their houses anymore. And she did all their grocery shopping. And she took them to the doctor. Their kids were far, far away because this was a retirement community. And she was far away from her own children. But she found a way to quietly go and care for these women. Probably most people had no idea. The only reason I found out is because I was pestering her because she was leaving while we were there to visit. But she was there, right? Being the church, showing up. Eventually she moved back closer to her kids. And my hope is that the church showed up, right? To bring those glimpses of new life and hope that the church can always bring. Today, this Bible story invites us to think about whose stories we don't hear, who's quietly suffering, and how, when we do hear those stories, we respond. The big stories are always going to be there. They're not unimportant, but they often miss the real things that are happening in people's day-to-day lives. And while we're listening for those stories, though, we don't do well at that because we're just good at it, right? We fail at it a lot. But the gospel today reminds us that we are the sheep, and that Jesus has a voice. And Jesus' voice is constantly coming to us. It comes to us in these waters of baptism where we are called each day to live anew. It comes to us at this table where we are reminded that grace is a free gift. It comes to us in those commands like love one another, wash one another's feet, and show up for those people that are suffering and struggling so that they can get those little glimmers of hope that are ours as well. I actually wonder how Peter responded when he said, Tabitha, get up, and she actually got up. Maybe that wasn't a surprise to him. I think it probably was. So that gift of her being raised was as much a gift for him as it was for her, and allowed him to go and maybe listen a little better next time to the people that he encountered along the way. Amen.